strange and mystical, powerful and wise, and yet savage all the same. The Centaur is perhaps the most interesting creature to have ever walked through the forests of Greece. Misbegotten, born from the selfish or unthinking acts of gods, the Centaur makes for a very strange creature, somewhat reminiscent of the mermaid, possessing the upper body of a human being, amalgamated with the entire body of a horse. However, unlike the mermaid, the Centaur is decidedly less threatening, despite being equally lethal. What makes the Centaur quite unique among other such creatures is that it tends to live in tribes or small groups, and also tends to make use of tools and weapons, while also living in caves or straw huts. The objects that the Centaur uses are relatively simple in design, and rarely go beyond what we would see with chimps. However, they have been known to create and use bows with which they hunt down prey items. Despite this relatively simple lifestyle, the Centaur is an intelligent creature, and they are well known for their skill with and knowledge of herbs and medicinal plants, making for excellent healers and teachers of medicinal arts. Indeed, it was through this caring nature that they had come to know some of the most famous heroes in human history. As such, they are widely known as healers and are thought to be more in tune with nature than most sapient creatures. Being sentient grants several characteristics to the Centaur that we don't see in other creatures. Namely, they have a vibrant, although often obscure culture. Festivals and other celebrations are of some import to the Centaur culture, and these are perhaps the reasons for which the Centaurs are most well known. Their weddings in particular, despite occasionally ending in violence, are quite grand affairs that average humans have attended and been able to report on occasionally. Its lustful nature combined with a penchant for violence while intoxicated reveals another, more frightening side of these creatures, as their tendency for violence of all kinds seems to enhance when in the presence of wine and other alcoholic drinks. The political and hierarchical makeup of the Centaur tribe is poorly understood. However, history has shown that there are those whose names carry more weight than others, although Centaurs are nevertheless very individualistic creatures. In war, they are a frightful foe to encounter, fast and lethal. Despite their relatively primitive tools of war, their equine nature allows them to run down or outrun even the most determined of foe, making for a particularly frightful creature, which is only enhanced because, despite their individualistic lifestyle, they are quite deadly when working as a group and can bring even the mightiest of armies to their knees. Savage, yet noble, primitive, yet sophisticated, the Centaur is certainly an enigmatic creature, if ever there was. Despite being a relatively obscure creature in historical mythology, the Centaur has nevertheless found a unique position for itself in modern culture, especially in works of high fantasy. Of similar commonality to satyrs, dryads, and triads, the Centaur is most often depicted in European and American fiction as a noble, although exceedingly rare and powerful creature. The Centaur itself is something of an enigma in common culture, where we would be hard-pressed to call to memory the names of but a few centaurs or describe their personalities beyond the set stereotypes they are often given. They usually take a back seat to most mythical creatures in fantasy. This neglect serves to enhance their mysterious status, as they are often used as a form of deus ex machina in various stories, such as the Chronicles of Narnia or Harry Potter, often tipping situations in favor of the protagonists, or outright saving them from certain doom. Of particular note is the depiction of the Centaurs in the book and film series Percy Jackson and the Olympians. In the story, the more wild and rebellious nature of the Centaurs is enhanced, where we find them depicted as wild partygoers and generally rowdy individuals, bringing to the fore those often neglected characteristics we see depicted in the original Greek myths. This connection to Greek myths is often a prerequisite for the appearance of the Centaur, particularly in renditions of the Hercules myth. The Centaur is almost inseparable from this hero's fiction, and nearly every depiction of Hercules features a centaur of some kind. It is with this in mind that we examine the Centaur's place in Greek culture. Ostensibly having several origins, the Greek Centaur was said to be found in the forests of Thessaly and Cyprus. The Thessalonian Centaurs were born from the deformed Centaurus, who was the first to group the stars into clusters. He supposedly mated with the mares from mainland Greece and gave rise to the Centaurs there. Like most Greek myths, his lineage is quite long, as Centaurus himself is born from the union of a cloud named Nephili and the divinely cursed Ixion. The Cyprian Centaurs have a less complicated origin, as they arose from the spilled seed of an impatient Zeus, who was unable to find the goddess Aphrodite in time to satisfy his more base urges. From the ground Zeus fertilized sprang the Cyprian Centaurs, who more closely resemble fauns or satyrs in that they bear horns upon their heads. Often depicted as quite lustful and somewhat bad drunks, the Centaur occupied a curious position in Greek mythology as a representative of a culture somewhere between civility and savagery, possessing obscure and primal wisdom. Roman culture would eventually come to adopt the Centaur as part of their own. Most famously, Constantine is depicted as having a chariot drawn by a pair of centaurs. This was most likely due to the conflict and mutual respect that these two cultures had for one another. The Romans would preserve the centaur and leave it entirely unaltered for the duration of their civilization, bringing it to our modern times more or less intact. This latter point is made all the more surprising because we often find that mythological creatures are significantly altered after the advent of Abrahamic religions, particularly Christianity when it comes to European myths. However, the centaur is one of the few creatures to be spared any kind of alteration, despite, and perhaps because, of its lack of popularity. Indeed, in modern times we still see the centaur as a wise and noble beast, powerful and free of spirit, though with its libidinous nature toned down. It is undeniable that we will nevertheless continue to cling to this myth for some time to come, even though we may not often see it. We can certainly say that the centaur's place in the modern world is definitely a curious one. The source of the centaur myth is interesting because although we do not often encounter this creature in fantasy, it nevertheless has quite a variety of potential influences upon which it draws. This interest is enhanced when we consider that the centaur comes to us almost exclusively from the ancient Grecian culture, where we would generally expect a consensus as to what would generate it. We have already seen the mythological origins of the centaur traced to the lustful exploits of various Greek deities, though the real-world inspiration is far less specific. The most commonly attributed inspiration comes from the southern Greek states, who were not horse-riding cultures. Upon encountering the Thessalonians, who employed horses for the use of combat, the southern Greek cultures were initially stunned by this innovation, and subsequently developed the myth of the centaur. What's more is that the various eastern barbarian groups encountered by the Greeks also used horses for warfare. This may go some way to explaining the partially barbaric personality of the centaur. It is difficult to imagine how a man riding a horse might become a horseman. However, there are several possibilities as to why this development occurred. Initially, we might consider that the warriors encountering horse-riding opponents were attempting to communicate the skill of the Thessalonian riders and describe their skill in metaphorical terms, as though they were a part of the horse, etc. This, combined with the natural mutation of retellings of stories, could well lead to the centaur creature being brought into existence. However, this option does stretch the facts of the matter somewhat, as we might consider some more obscure possibilities. One such possibility is found in the 2014 rendition of Hercules, starring Dwayne Johnson. A scene halfway through the film depicts a group of riders silhouetted upon a hill, where the shadows of the horse and its rider merge as though they were a single entity. The stance of the riders in the scene is somewhat odd, as they are in no way holding on to the reins of the horse or attempting to control the animal in any way. This does stretch the limits of what is reasonable to some extent. However, it is not entirely outside the realms of possibility when combined with the aforementioned mutation of stories. There do exist more academic investigations into the origin of the centaur. The novelist Robert Graves traces the origin of the centaur back to ancient Indian cults, claiming that the modern myths are the remnant of a half-remembered pagan deity. Graves suggests that the Indian Gandharva is perhaps the earliest progenitor of our modern centaur. In Indian culture, the Gandharva are messengers of the gods, and they are usually depicted as a human combined with the body or features of either horses or birds. Skilled with song and known for their fighting ability, these creatures do share some characteristics with the centaur. However, tracing the origins of the Gandharva is very difficult. It appears that they are perhaps connected to the Kinnaris tribe, which was found in the Himalayas. The Kinnaris are often historically linked to horses in some fashion or another, primarily for war. Though we may never know the exact origin of the centaur, we can perhaps take the commonalities from all of these possibilities and draw some conclusions. Looking more broadly at the various aspects in this origin, we can most certainly say that the Centaur is indeed inspired by various sedentary cultures encountering the horse-bound raiding parties of various barbarian tribes. Both in Indian and Greek culture, we see the Centaur is linked closely to war and spiritualism, something we can justify as being easily observed by these cultures encountering the barbarian raiding groups. Though the wisdom of the Centaur is hard to explain, we might be able to chalk that up to the Indian and Greek cultures being surprised at how cunning and innovative the relatively primitive horse-riding cultures were. Though we may never know the true origin of the Centaur, it is certainly clear that there is a peculiar type of inspiration at work here, demonstrating how intercultural interaction can itself lead to an interesting and new legend. Like most human-animal amalgams, the Centaur is quite a difficult creature to reify. This is due in part to two main problems presented by this creature. The first is evolutionary and the second is thermodynamically. The evolutionary problem is quite simple to state, but very difficult to solve. How may we justify a creature coming to resemble an amalgam of human and horse? Unlike the mermaid, the Centaur doesn't prey upon human beings, nor does the human torso provide any camouflage. As a consequence, it's quite difficult to justify the development of such a specific form for the upper body area of the Centaur. We might consider the usefulness provided by hands as the primary reason for this adaptation. However, this doesn't justify the overall development of the human torso. Indeed, very little would naturally drive this evolution beyond intentional genetic manipulation. This could perhaps be justified considering the divine intervention responsible for their creation in myth. We could consider this as a metaphor for the intervention of some other being with mastery of genetic manipulation, though invoking advanced alien civilizations or some sudden breakthrough in our own understanding of genetic engineering is perhaps too unreasonable. Beyond the evolutionary imperatives that would create such a specific form, we must also consider the metabolic requirements of a creature such as the Centaur, which must essentially maintain the energy requirements of what basically amounts to as two separate animals, namely the horse portion and the human portion. This latter point was explored to great extent in P.J. Farmer's World of Tears series, where the Centaur is created by a godlike alien. In this series, the human portion of the Centaur consists almost entirely of lung tissue to take in sufficient amounts of oxygen to fuel both portions of the animal. This is in addition to a carnivorous diet, an enhanced digestive tract, as well as a larger neck and mouth to accompany the lung portion of the creature. Though the extent of this alteration leaves us with quite an horrific creature indeed, needless to say, these alterations would be vital to the functioning of the creature, and as such, if we want to maintain the overall form and shape of the Centaur, we simply cannot do without it. Interestingly, the series also invokes the divine creation of the Centaur by way of an advanced alien intelligence, perhaps lending credence to the necessity of artificial intervention in this creature's creation. If we take the World of Tears interpretation of the Centaur to further extremes, we're able to abandon the classical image of the Centaur in favor of something more plausible, although decidedly more unsettling. Renditions of the Centaurs, such as those found in the Fallout series, are the deformed result of a forced evolutionary virus, a plot point from that series. These beasts are more monster than man, yet they are somewhat more possible than those in the Grecian culture due to their smaller size and more uniform variation of tissues. Despite its unattractiveness, this version does meet many of the qualities required by the Centaur, such as a human torso on a quadrupedal frame, and due to mutation-induced brain damage, we find this creature to be quite savage, but far too unintelligent to be considered the cognitive equal of the legendary Centaur, making it not quite what we would require from our Centaur. Alas, it would appear that the Centaur, as originally envisioned, is not entirely possible. We can only look to more Cronenberg-esque inspirations to find any possible semblance of similarity to the fictional Centaur. However, hope for this creature does remain. Due to its essentially artificial nature, both in its myth as well as in its various renditions, we can certainly accept any version of this creature we could feasibly imagine. So long as we remain within the laws of thermodynamics, it's possible to pass almost any humanoid quadruped off as a Centaur. And with our ever-improving understanding of genes and genetic manipulation, Who knows what creatures we may dream up in the future?